Once again, we are back with Usanas Dialogues after a small hiatus because we organized the Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue. And today we have a very, very interesting topic to discuss with us. A new vigor in India's Europe engagement, making sense amidst global conflicts. Now, this is something which I find really peculiar because I remember almost in PhD 2023, we started this engagement with the Greek embassy. Greek ambassador came, and right after that, Prime Minister of Greece came to India, and after that, we have seen the EU delegations are coming to India. Even after the abrogation of Article 370, we had EU delegations visiting Kashmir. And today, we are at a very interesting point in the world of geopolitics. Many developments are happening across the world, and amidst all these developments, we have this really good news about India's enhanced and strengthened engagement with Europe. But definitely, it has its own nuances and complexities, which we'll be discussing in today's session. And for this interesting topic, today we are joined by two very eminent experts and veterans in their field. And I would like to introduce them first. After that, we'll start. So we have today with us Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya. Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya is a former ambassador to Switzerland, Egypt, Turkey, and Arab League. He is a professor of diplomatic practice at Jindal School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University. As ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein, he advanced bilateral partnership in technology, innovation, investments, and initiated academic ties and leveraged Davos diplomacy. As ambassador to Turkey, he promoted economic exchanges and managed the tense bilateral relations. As ambassador to Egypt and Arab League, he built a strategic partnership with progress in economic and defense exchanges to add to the existing cultural relations. As Joint Secretary South in the Ministry of External Affairs, he crafted India's Act East policy in ASEAN and beyond, and coordinated economic diplomacy with ASEAN countries, initiated Indo-Pacific dialogue, and structured engagement with the Pacific Island states. As Deputy High Commissioner in Dhaka, he was involved in the historic land boundary agreement in building economic linkages. As DCM in Tokyo, he facilitated investment flows and elevation of ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And as DCM in Beijing, he oversaw boundary issues and bilateral relations. As a young diplomat, he also worked on EU relations in Brussels and as a political officer in Beijing and Hong Kong. In headquarters, he worked mostly on East Asia, external publicity, Americas, and finance divisions. Sir, you have a very vast and a very diverse range of experience. I am pretty sure one session is not enough to understand and to get advantage, get benefit from your experience and your understanding of these various issues. You have seen history. Definitely will take some of these other issues like the bilateral issues with China and many other issues in our future sessions. Another speaker that we have with us today is Mr. Marian Duris. Marian has been to Usanas events earlier also, and Marian Duris is a foreign policy expert with a keen eye on European affairs. He has experience in international relations and security sphere in the United Kingdom, and he has served as advisor to the member of European Parliament. He monitors the current affairs to predict trends, legislation process of EU, initiatives of European Commission, and background activities that affect the sovereignty of countries. Marian has also written several papers for Usanas Foundation. So we are very happy to see you again. So now we are going to start our discussion. So before I get into India's engagement with Europe, I guess, it'll be a good primer to understand what's happening in Europe. So for that, over to you, Marian. A lot of things are happening in Europe. We hear, I don't know, we may sound a little pessimistic, but there's a general perception that the transatlantic security architecture is almost dead, and Europe's equations with the US is in doldrums. Things are quite confused. So I'll leave it to you. Then I'll ask specific questions. Would you like to briefly summarize what's exactly happening in your part of the world?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, because it's very complex question, of course, this transatlantic ties. Yes, this important times are effect or consequence of elections in presidential elections in the United States. There was kind of change in White House, So European Union is trying to adapt on this new geopolitical environment right now. And that's exactly the thing, because as I saw it in last years. So, for example, if we take foreign policy or security policy in Europe as a whole, so it was relied really on a United States partner, and it was very comfortable position for many bureaucrats, many officials and representatives in the European Union. Just let everything on decision making in the White House and on our bigger partner. And now it's a huge change, because Mr. Trump, as a new president, asked Europe to be more okay, to give and invest more money to defense, to producing of arms and ammunition, to give more percents of GDP to this area. And Europe is kind in shock right now, because European economics is not in so good condition to make it from this kind of jump from 2% to 5%. Okay, you have, of course, differences between economics, between countries, between their geographies and their interests. For example, Poland is the third biggest army in NATO. They invest a huge amount of GDP to defense, and it's around, I think 4%. On the other side, you have countries would give less than 2%. So there is huge huge effort how Europe will react in this sense. So I see, yeah, many officials are shocked in this way, and I would say they are trying to find their own environment, their own positions, if it's in security, if it's in foreign policy, if it's in bilateral relations, what we will speak about probably now.
Thank you. So one question to you. We see that Europe's equation is with the US is getting worse, with every passing day. And on the other hand, you have an extreme economic dependence and connectedness, trade linkages with China. There's this huge supply chain dependence, and also, but at the same time, there's an immense fear of Chinese hegemony and monopoly over the supply chains and all. So, in this context, how do you look at India? I mean, how do you perceive India? Do you see India as some kind of a replacement of China to de-risk, or like decouple from China, or as a complementary partner just to diversify your foreign policy in terms of economic interest and security interests?
As I see it, in case of United States, after this change in the White House, Mr. Trump turned on India as a partner. We saw that Mr. Narendra Modi was in the White House, and they discussed with Mr. Trump important issues. So I see for United States India will be important partner in sense of this geostrategy or geopolitics in kind of in the Pacific region. In this point of view, I would say for Europe will be India still more important than before. So I see it as an opportunity to make more, to invest more time, more energy to strengthen these ties, and not only in trade sense. I would say there are many areas what we can cooperate on. So I hope United States stance will be inspiration for European, not only Union, but Europe as a continent, because European Union is just 27 countries. Europe consists from many more countries. So I hope it will be inspiration from abroad, from in this Atlantic sense, and Europe will strengthen these ties, and I hope it will be very soon in next years.
Thank you. Excellency, now I have a question for you. First, I request you to just provide a brief overview of India's relationship with Europe over the last 75 years. Just a brief overview for our audience. And then I have a very specific question. So we see today that we have a very enhanced engagement with Europe. Armenia has emerged as India's, one of the biggest defense partner. India is selling a large number of arms to Armenia. With France, we have extended defense deals. The European Union President Ursula was here very recently. We have visitors from Greek, and so there's this very strong engagement that we see with the various European countries. So in that context, my question is that is it just a very reactionary, a very passive approach that Europe is interested in India and we are simply just reacting to that, or do we have a deeper geopolitical thought while exploring this outreach?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me at this discussion panel. Delighted to be here. I think the question of Europe and India's relations with Europe should be looked at in the context of both our history as well as the evolving geopolitics over time. I think you rightly mentioned that we should have a very brief look at what has happened in the last 75 odd years. In other words, since the time India became independent. And you would notice that during that time, after the end of the Cold War, when India shook off the colonial shackle, India decided to remain in the Commonwealth and retain a certain link with Britain, and also did not join the Cold War as an ally of either the Soviets or the Americans, but rather to bring about a new configuration of the non-aligned movement, in which it was able to diversify its support base across in the geopolitical space. And what that meant was that for India, it was extremely important right from the outset to have very close partnerships in Europe. And you saw these happening, not just with the UK, but primarily with France and Germany and Italy and several others over a period of time, which consolidated. And I think in some ways, what it helped to do was not only to diversify our principal interest in advancing our development agenda, but in also diversifying our security interests and concerns. And I think that trend has continued. So for me, as I look at history and as I look at the evolving geopolitics, I think India's stand has been rather principled and consistent over a period of time. And so the strategic autonomy that we talk of today, or the emergence of multipolarity, is something that is still continuing. And in some ways, there were elements of it, perhaps in different degrees in the past. I have a comment, if I may, on your earlier question of the current developments in Europe. I agree entirely with the summation of the events that are unfolding in Europe with my co-panelists. However, I do see it in a slightly different context. I interpret them somewhat differently. I think over a period of time, the dependence that Europe had bestowed upon the United States and the reliance that it had placed on NATO, in which the principal benefactor was across the Atlantic, was perhaps beyond its shelf life. And I think that needed a reset. And I think this reset was initially realized by the Europeans themselves. So I don't think what is happening today is just a reaction to what Mr. Trump is doing out of Washington, D.C. Because, when the Europe was consolidating, there were talks for strengthening the European defense capability of having heavy lift capability, having independent brigades, which could actually advance its course in theaters that could have emerged in different parts of the world. So the idea of having a stronger presence in the security sector was there in the past, and that was from decades ago. I think that is now something that has become more urgent, and I'm happy to see that the Europeans, despite the economic situation that they are going through at present, and I do believe it's only a temporary phase, are focusing more on economy. Because if you look at the geopolitical situation, what we have seen is that while the geoeconomic gravity may have shifted from the transatlantic domain towards East Asia, the geostrategic power has not yet shifted entirely. And the technology centers and innovation, which drive growth into the future, have not yet shifted entirely. And so Europe must regain its past in order to secure its future. And I think the interest in the defense security sector will be an important element. So I look at the current developments from a slightly different perspective. And so what I see today happening, the adjustments that Europe is seeking to make are extremely welcome, and I would strongly support that this go ahead. And I think that kind of meshes in with the kind of idea that India has believed, in which there must be these strong multipolar strengths across the globe, and Europe would definitely be able to get back to that position.
Thank you. So just adding a little more to my second question, what exactly is a geostrategic thought behind this, this renewed outreach with Europe? Because there are many challenges that I see. We are really great, particularly in this whole Ukraine-Russia, this war saga. India has emerged as even stronger partner with Russia, and also the personal bonding between Mr. Putin and Prime Minister Modi makes this relationship very strong. So in that context, how are we going to balance? Because in Europe, we see that the major countries have taken a very harsh stance against Russia. Besides that, there are other issues like the European NGOs, human rights organizations. They often complain about issues like press freedom, minority rights in India. They come out with umpteen number of reports pertaining to the decline of democracy in India. So with all these things, what are the main challenges, and what are the main opportunities? This is the one question. And my second question is that how is China going to look at India's engagement with Europe?
Right. So, I think India places very high importance to its relations with Europe, and we see it not merely in the context of our economic relations, which of course is very important, but also in the overall geopolitical context. And therefore, we would wish it to be framed in that broader context. I must say that Europe often tends to look at its relations with India largely from just the economic context. And perhaps that is one of the reasons why we have not made adequate progress in many of the economic relations and say even on the SEPA or FTA that we've been negotiating. Because once you look at a broader framework, what you are working for is producing a larger cake that you can both share, rather than squabbling for the same small size cake that you have at present. So I do see that there are great opportunities, which actually, in my mind, outweigh the challenges. But let me first talk of the challenges. The first challenge is on the economic sphere itself. And if we are to try and work out a SEPA or FTA, what we will see is that there will be certain offensive interests and certain defensive interests on both sides, and how to find a balance if you are just looking at a small cake. But if we are looking at a scenario where we say we try to double or quadruple our trade volumes and investment flows and technology collaborations, then I think you have a different scenario and different possibilities. And once you weave in the idea of how you work together on supply chains, you will find that your potential for collaboration, the kind of concessions that you would be make on some of your defensive interests would actually enlarge, and therefore that potential will need to be realized. And I think the thinking has begun on those lines, and we are hoping that we will see a conclusion to that economic issue by the end of the year. We also see that there are certain concerns that are often voiced by civil society in Europe about various issues pertaining to human rights or democracy. And I must tell you and I must share with you, frankly, that we no longer need any certificates from anybody, certainly not from the Europeans. We don't call out things that are happening in Europe, but that's because we are polite and we are an old civilization. But that does not mean that we are happy with everything that's happening in our country either. When we see that there are inadequacies, we try and correct them. We have various institutions that act as checks and balances. And I think we are on the right track. So I think we don't need people who come and preach to us. And Europe needs to realize this, because for very long, it has lived in the past, and it needs to get out of that particular cloak that it lives under. And this is what brings me to that last point, which is how we look at strategy. I think the kind of perception that prevails in Europe about Russia is largely misplaced. And I will say this very frankly, because the so-called Russian threat is perhaps only a minuscule of the so-called Chinese threat. And I think Europe needs to understand this. And to frame a new partnership with Russia is what will not only drive Europe's revitalization and rejuvenation, but will also make the world a much more peaceful and harmonious place. And I think it's not fair to simply criticize the leader of Russia in the terms that are often that are attributed to him. And I think if we have that particular understanding and willingness to have dialogue and to see the thing really as it was, and there was a period of time when there was a certain rapprochement with Russia, there was a G8, there was increased economic activity between Europe and Russia, and I think it all led to a common good, and I think the economies were doing well too, that would be the way forward, because I think having an antagonistic situation is not worthwhile. After all, let us remember that the European Union was really based on doing away with the enmity that had lived for centuries between two European countries. And it is time that you reached out and actually worked out this relationship with Russia. On Ukraine as well, I think it is extremely unfortunate that the sovereignty of a country was violated. But I think there should have been other ways to deal with this rather than prolong a war which has led to death and destruction of Ukrainians. The kind of tragedy that has befallen Ukraine, the country, and Ukraine, the people, is most horrific. And I think the Europeans will be partly guilty for having supported this continuance of war. And I hope that peace prevails. We have consistently argued for having peace and for abstaining for war. And I'm happy that despite the fact that it's happening at a rather late date, that talks for peace are now gathering momentum.
Thank you. Thank you, Excellency. I'll get back to you with a few more questions. But before that, I have some really interesting questions for Marian. So yes, Marian, first, how do you look at the things unfolding on the Ukraine front? And my second question is regarding the rise of the right in Europe. Do you think that the right-wing parties will be able to have better equation with the Russians? Because I visited Russia recently at least twice, and I had long discussions with Dr. Alexander Dugin. He's perfectly fine with the traditional Russia. Like, he's against wokeism, and I guess many right-wing conservative parties in Europe, they kind of, follow a similar line of thought, which resonates with Dr. Dugin's thought. So this is my second question. And my third question pertaining to the right is that, do you think that the right-wing parties or the rise of the right in Europe is also one of the reasons that India's bonhomie with Europe is increasing? I mean, because India also has a very strong Hindu nationalist right-wing government. So is it some kind of a right alliance?
Yeah, it's very good questions, I would say. But I still return to Excellency and his remarks. I would say if this kind of pragmatic approach and this rational mindset Europe would have, so I think Europe would have much more and better relations with many countries around the world. And when you mention this kind of lecturing of countries around the world because of many reasons, if it's human rights, minorities, topics, etc. Yeah, these topics are unfortunately very favorite in the majority, in current majority in European Parliament and European Commission, I would say. So some kind of pragmatism would be very needed, and it will be good way how to deal with relations and topics. So yeah, when you mentioned this Ukraine thing, yeah, Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin try to deal with this topic. They are trying to finish this conflict, as they say, and they are meeting. If it was a summit in Riyadh, if it was a format in Istanbul, so they are trying their best to finish this conflict. When we see it from European perspective, there are many countries who are trying to replace amount of arms and ammunition and funds to Ukraine when United States are not planning to do it more. I'm not sure if European countries are able to replace this amount of supplies to Ukraine. So Ukraine is in difficult situation, and it is still more difficult than before. Because we saw Kursk offensive, we saw many other situations according the front line. So Ukraine is in difficult situation, and mainly we saw this event of Volodymyr Zelensky and his meeting with Mr. Trump. So when you saw this meeting it was in Jeddah, I think. So Mr. Zelensky was not present, and it is because of very good reasons, I would say. And the United States does not consider maybe this leader as able to finish this conflict, and rather they invited some other representative of Ukrainian government. When we talk about right wing and the rise of right wing in the European Union, yes, there is okay, we can say about some kind of majority in European institutions, and there is big center-right party which is called EPP. But I'm sure they are more oriented in these days more on Russian threat and these kind of topics. They are not talking much about development or renewal of this kind of relations to the east of European Union. So it's tough to include them to this kind of discussions. If we say about right-wing other factions of European Parliament and institutions, there are, for example, faction like Europe of Sovereign Nations, which is faction which very balanced approach to the relations with India, to the renewable Russian ties in case of energy, in case of other areas. So depends. When we say about right-wing, it depends which kind of part of these right-wing parties we talk about, because this faction and every part of this faction, because these factions have many delegations from many countries, have different interests. So their viewpoints on development of these ties and relations, if it's India, if it's China, if it's transatlantic ties, if it's ties with Russia, Ukraine, etc., there are different viewpoints. So we should maybe we should specify which kind of or part of right-wing parties we take. But I see there much more hope. What about balancing and diversification of relations of Europe to mutual beneficiency of all actors in these relations to the future, to the next years.
Thank you. And Mr. Marian, do you think that enmity with Russia is actually driving Russia more and more into the Chinese fold? I mean, do you agree with this assessment?
Sorry, can you repeat it, please?
I'm saying that Europe's enmity and a very rigid stand against Russia is driving the Russians more and more into the Chinese fold.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think this approach of European countries and European Union did not help to these relations with Eastern countries. And yes, exactly, when you give 16 packages of sanctions to Russia, to so-called third countries who European Union says they are helping to Russia to circumvent these sanctions. Last time it was in topic of shadow fleets, so-called shadow fleets. So yes, necessary or inevitable result of this approach, European approach, is that Russia will develop ties with other countries, because Russia has huge amount of natural resources, and carbohydrates. So you have to find new markets when you lost huge market like Europe is. So in this sense, I would more rely on specific countries in Europe, not on European Union as a whole, because there are many representatives which are not considered like legitimate leaders of Europe. It's this kind of feeling what is developing in many countries, because in the European Union you vote just for European Parliament members, yeah. But in case of European Commission, this is another topic. It's another way how are these people voted and elected in these institutions. So it's kind of indirected vote. So in many countries there are many skeptic representatives who sees these leaders as not legitimate, and maybe that's the reason why these ties, for example, with India or with Russia, renewal of Russian ties, are developed on the level of bilaterality. So specific country, for example, Poland or Hungary or Slovak Republic, and this kind of Eastern Europe countries are developing own ties without some kind of discussion with European Union institutions. So yes, I think this kind of pragmatic and healthy approach would go more from these countries in next months and next years than from a European institution. But everything is possible, of course.
Thank you. One more question for you, and then I'll come back to Excellency again. So these days we see that there's this, a major common ground that's emerging in India-Europe equation is the challenge of Islamic extremism. Every second day we get to hear about, some lone wolf attack in Germany, someone ramming the roadside civilians walking on the streets. So how does Europe plan to tackle with the major challenge of Islamic radicalization and terrorism? And do you think that there can be any synergies with India which can be explored, developed in the future, given that India has about more than 3 decades of experience in dealing with the Pakistani-sponsored terrorist actors?
I think there should be really huge communication and exchange of information and experiences in this area, I would say. European Union has different stance in this area, because European institutions are developing many so-called strategies like migration pact, new pact on migration and asylum, and this kind of stuff. But when you see this kind of documents, it's not about improving security of Europe and European citizens. It's just legalization of illegal migration in this, for example, in this last try in case of a new pact on migration and asylum. And when you see exactly these kind of events, like you mentioned, so people have this kind of feeling, these people in European institution does not work for them, So maybe that's the reason why they more rely on national leaders on their state level, not on a European level. And yes, these are absolutely horrific events, tragic events, what are happening maybe every day. I was in Brussels before the month, and there was 4 cases during the 4 days of shooting on one metro station. So that's the situation. What is in European mainly capitals, I would say, because you have this kind of no-go zones or areas where even army or police don't go, because because these people inside of these zones are absolutely, there is environment of absolute crime, I would say, and absolute hostility against state forces and officials. So Europe must act probably. There is a bigger hope on a national level than on a European level in this way, because you have kind of ideology of welcoming, I would say. So we should wait for kind of maybe change, more to the right-wing parties and representatives who represent this kind of approach, this improving of security of Europe, closing or protecting the borders, external borders, because the European Union has Schengen area, a Schengen zone. So that's the way how we work, because citizens must trust the representatives, and representatives should do more for them. Exactly. So that's the way what is now, and maybe in the next years, I would say the more people will vote for this kind of right-wing representatives who will try to protect borders and protect their safety in the streets and in their countries.
Thank you. Ambassador Bhattacharya, would you like to respond to any of the comments of Mr. Marian? Then I have two questions for you.
Right. I would just wish to kind of mention about the migration issue that Mr. Marian mentioned, and I do get the sense, and I agree with him, that there needs to be more that needs to be done. I think primarily the issues of integration of migrant communities has to be done in a more inclusive manner. And it is only then that you would be able to have a better information of what's going on, and also to keep security more at bay. But I think this issue of inclusivity has to go beyond just the issue of migration. And therefore, inclusivity has to be in development, in security, and it has to go beyond to the places from where these migrants come. And therefore, a somewhat more understanding approach would perhaps benefit. But having said that, I do believe that the issue of Islamic radicalization is a very serious issue and a great challenge to all of us, to all civilizations. And I think we need to deal with it very resolutely. We have, as you had also mentioned, faced the issues pertaining to radicalization, and some of it has been manifest in the form of cross-border terrorism as well. But unless we deal with this right from the roots and strike it out, we will not be able to address the issue.
Thank you. So now I have a question for you that's pertaining to India's quest for the access to the European markets. So today we see there are two competitive strategic connectivity projects. One is IMAC and the other one is INSTC. We were really gung-ho about the future of IMAC towards the end of the G20. After that, this whole Israel-Hamas situation happened in West Asia. And today it seems that IMAC's future is very uncertain, because even today the Hamas-Israel deal is very uncertain and it's very flimsy. At the same time, because of India's strengthened ties with Russians and with the Armenians, we see a very good future for the INSTC. So how do you look at these two projects in a comparative perspective?
So, the first thing about connectivity issues is that the issue is not so much about ownership, but about access and availability. And therefore, if there are even BRI projects that build that connectivity, we can always use that. We have serious issues with BRI, which are on sovereignty and feasibility and other things that happened in various parts of the world. But purely in terms of the infrastructure that they create and the opportunities for connectivity that they create need to be taken advantage of by everybody. But coming to the two specific ones that have been in the making for some time, the INSTC is a fabulous project, but it has a certain link with Iran, which many in the West are not so fond of. and the access through Iran towards Central Asia and beyond towards Russia and further on towards Europe is something that becomes, in a sense, somewhat vulnerable. Similarly, the IMEC project, which goes through the Middle East and has a hub in Israel, has become somewhat vulnerable because of the ongoing hostilities in that region and the war that's ongoing, the conflict that is ongoing between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And so both these have become victims of certain prejudices on the one hand, as well as conflict on the other. But I think we should look at the broader idea of what they were trying to do. And for this, the two actually presented slightly different scenarios. IMEC was more of a broad-based concept, which was trying to plug in the advantage that happens because of the expansion geographically of value chains and of technology developments and innovations, and how the Middle East is becoming a new area of economic activity, of technological dynamism, which you can then take advantage of, and becomes like a pivot between India, which is another region that is growing at rather rapid rates, and Europe, which is an old partner of India, and how these can then connect together. So the eastern leg, which is between India and the Middle East, and the northern leg, which is between the Middle East and Europe, would then connect in a seamless manner towards a future-oriented approach. The North-South corridor, in contrast, was more of a traditional connectivity approach in which you build infrastructure, plug the gaps that are there in rail linkages or whatever, upgrade the capacity of ports in certain places, and then try and have an alternate route. And I think that's more about how business used to be done in the past. So I would be much more optimistic in the future about the IMEC. And if we were to link it up with other developments that have a role in this particular area, primarily two. One is the I2EU2, which brings in a new dimension across the Atlantic. And the second is the Indo-Pacific, because this is often not talked about as much, is that once you link in the Indo-Pacific into this particular concept, because it essentially links in with our Sagar project as well, which is an extension of the Indo-Pacific. And now that the Europeans are much more invested in the dimensions of the Indo-Pacific, that is the other connectivity aspect, which has not only the economic, but the technological and the geopolitical dimensions. And so I am much more optimistic about the IMEC in that context, though I do hope that the North-South corridor also has the progress that we had hoped it would.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I have one final question, and that's for both of you. So how do you look at Europe's position in the emerging multipolar world order?
Is that to me?
For both of you. I mean, first you and then Marian can take up the question.
Certainly.
Is it going to be a strong, united pole in itself, or it's going to be a divided entity under the influence of the major powers of the world? Please feel free. Over to you.
So I value very highly the role that Europe plays in the global community. And I think it was really batting below par. And I think the potential for Europe was much higher than what we had seen in the last few decades. And part of the slowdown that we'd seen in Europe, the crises that had hit Europe, the recession that had come there, the social tensions that we see today are because of this slight pullback in Europe. But I'm happy that there are trends within Europe which were actually endogenous, and perhaps to some extent the developments across the Atlantic might have given it further impetus. I think Europe will regain its stature because, after all, it is the land of the new Enlightenment. It is the land where technology developed in many, many ways. And it is the land which actually spread a number of value systems across the globe. It did tend to become somewhat overbearing at times, which I think, rising powers will not take very kindly to. And so I think the role of Europe will have to change a bit, but I think will remain and perhaps grow in importance. We, for ourselves in India, value our partnership with Europe and attach the highest priority to it. So I would wish that Europe get back to its stature, that we can build a stronger partnership, that we can contribute more to not only our own development, but also to the ideas on global issues and global affairs, so that we can become a positive factor in all this.
Thank you. Over to you, Marian.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I think Europe has important position in the world, and you can see it. You can see this changing by the decades. You could saw Europe after World War and this reconstruction and this absolutely great era of 70s, 80s, when strong leaders appeared, strong leaders from social democracy parties, from Christian democracy parties, and they developed European economics in phenomenal way. And it was because of pragmatic approach in case of foreign policy, in case of social policy, in case of defense, all these areas, they approached them with pragmatism, with the rational way, not with over ideologization, I would say. So if they will return, if leaders of Europe, if it will be on European level, if it will be on national level, if they will return to this kind of thinking, not lecturing everyone how he should do, what kind of politics, what kind of ties and trade ties he has, I think there is much more needed this pragmatism, balanced way, mutually beneficial ties. And we saw it in last decades. European economics, German economics was developed on cheap energies from Russia mainly. So that's just one fact what should be considered maybe to the future, to the next years. And these people should be inspired by past, a glorious past of Europe, of these ties, if it was with Russia, if it's with India, if it's in every other country where what we can cooperate with. And in this way, Europe can be bigger, greater, more prosperous in every way. That's the thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So with this, we come to the end of our today's discussion. Ambassador Bhattacharya, thanks a ton for sharing your very insightful remarks and giving us a strong overview of India-Europe historical equations and also the future trajectory. Thank you very much, Marian, for sharing your insights on the events taking place in Europe. Since you're sitting there, so you're giving a first-hand account of what's exactly happening there. That's very much useful for us. Thank you. And I hope to see our audience soon in our next future Usanas Dialogue series. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.